And you will find also, you will find it on the webpage that we will share on the in the chat. Before I move forward with the presentations, I also want to inform you that we have an online course that is free and open access on the topic of governance, ethics, and conflict of interest in public health, that everybody is welcome to join and advertise about. We've had a good cohort of students participate, and the overall evaluation of the course has been very positive. So I'm going to start by saying how excited I am, and with pleasure presenting this lineup of speakers. Dr. Lisa Bero will start her presentation. It's an honor to have Dr. Bero present, as I know her as a researcher, as I was working on my doctorate degree in tobacco control. So I've seen your name many times, and it's my honor to have to present you here in this webinar. Dr. Bero is a professor of medicine and public health and the chief scientist at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities in the University of Colorado. She's a leader in evidence synthesis, meta-research, and studying commercial determinants of health, focusing on industries such as tobacco, pharma, and others. The next speaker will be Dr. Fabrri. Alice Fabrri is a lecturer at the University of Bath. She's a public health physician, and her work focuses specifically on conflict of interest and commercial influences on health. And finally, Dr. James Larkin is a postdoctoral research in the Royal College of Science and Medicine in Ireland. His research focuses on the marketing practices of the pharmaceutical companies and medical device industries. We will start with Dr. Bero for the interest of time and try to keep time for any questions or comments in the end. Thank you, everyone. So each speaker will be sharing their own slides, I believe.
Yes, they will. I think we're just waiting a bit for Dr. Bero, said that she's about to join. I'm not sure if she's here. I can't see her name here. But she just sent a link. She just sent me an email that she's joining now.
Okay, no, she is, I just saw her name. Excellent. Welcome, Dr. Bero. Great to have you on this webinar. I already did the introduction, so you are welcome to share your slides. Perfect. Oh. Okay, so there's a technical difficulty. We'll try to resolve it, but I know that Dr. Alice Fabrri, we can't hear you. I can see you now, though.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Here you go. Yes, yes, excellent.
Oh, I'm so sorry for the
no problem. We all face those issues.
And the delay.
No.
Let me pull up my
Thank you so much
slides.
for volunteering
and
to
actually, I
participate
could not
webinar.
open the joined slide presentation, so I will just run my own if that's okay.
Of course, whatever you see fit. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me just share this. And I'm very sorry again, and thank you for the introductions. I'm really thrilled to be part of this session. Where is the sharing now? Everything is different here. Okay, here we go.
Wonderful.
Can you just tell me if you see my slides? Okay, great.
Yes, we do.
Well, Well, thanks. And thanks for waiting, because I think this is a good introduction to the other speakers as well, because my talk here is going to be on pharmaceutical industry influence, specifically on research, which I will argue forms the foundation for a lot of what the other speakers are going to talk about. So here's my disclosure, which is lengthy, but the bottom line is I receive no funding from pharmaceutical industry for any of my work, and I do receive some funding from governments for being a conflict of interest advisor. So I think, we have to care about pharmaceutical industry funding for research, because this becomes a commercial determinant of health when companies fund unreliable or misleading research that's aimed at generating doubt around product harms, but I would argue with the pharmaceutical industry, also doubt or misleading information about the efficacy of products as well. And really, the research is so important, because if we don't have a solid research foundation, in my mind, everything else falls down. We don't have trustworthy evidence. We can't have reliable systematic reviews. We can't have reliable practice guidelines. And also this material, as Alice, I'm sure, will elaborate, can also show up in marketing and information for consumers. So there is a lot of bias and research on bias on pharmaceutical industry studies. And this is a definition of bias from the Cochrane collaboration. And bias is just an error or deviation from the truth in the results of a study. And I want to point out here that the problem is that the bias can cause an underestimate or an underestimate of the true effect. So in the case of a drug, what we're worried about is overestimating efficacy, but underestimating harm. And both of these things can happen. So this is a pug dog in a pug suit, and people like me do meta research, which is research on research. And you get things that look like this, a meta-analysis forest plot, and I'll just walk you through that. And actually, I love to talk about pharmaceutical industry influence versus some of the other industries I talk about, because this is actually where we have an abundance of evidence on the influence of the funder on the outcome of the research. So this figure is from a Cochrane review led by Andreas Lund, and we included 25 papers with almost 3,000 studies. And what these studies were looking at was whether pharmaceutical industry funding of the research on drugs produced a favorable efficacy result compared to research with other sponsors. So that's what all of these studies were looking at. And when we put them all together, so these were each individual studies with many, many papers inside of them. And when we put these all together, what we see is that studies with statistically significant efficacy results are about 30% more common or higher among industry-sponsored studies compared to non-industry sponsored studies. So it's more likely, if the study is industry funded, that it's going to find a result that favors the drug. And what's really important here is there's no difference in the risk of bias or the methods of the studies. So something else is happening to produce this bias. And from this same review, Cochrane review, this is the results I just told you that looked at efficacy results, but we also see favorable results in terms of harm. So that means the drug industry sponsored studies show less harm than studies with other sponsors, although this has only been studied in a few papers. And we also find the conclusions are more favorable towards the drug if they're funded by the pharmaceutical industry. So that is the interpretation of the authors, not the actual result itself. So we see it across all of these areas, the numerical results and the conclusions or interpretation of the authors. And this influence of the funder on the conclusions and the results has been termed funding bias. And so I may refer to that in my talk. But the big question is, we know from meta research that this funding bias exists. So how does it happen? And there's been a lot of research looking into this question. And we know that I call it a cycle of bias. It's really the cycle of research. You can introduce bias at any point in the cycle. How you ask the question, how you frame the agenda, the method that you actually use, how the study is conducted, and whether it's published or not, or if there's spin. And to look into this mechanism of how it happens, we have to turn to other data sources. And these might include internal industry documents, documents from regulatory agencies, or interview studies. So I'm not going to have time to go through a lot of this, but it's just to say a lot of methods have been applied to look at how this happens. And Alice Fabrri has done quite a bit of work on industry influence on the research agenda. And I will just say that in the pharmaceutical area, we find that drug companies tend to fund questions that are more related to their product, unsurprisingly, than any public health question. So this is a pattern we see with other industries. Now, regarding the method of the study, as I mentioned, and these are what I mean by methods. So is it truly randomized, the drug trial? Was there blinding of the participants? Things like that. The internal validity of the study doesn't differ much between drug industry sponsored studies and non-drug industry sponsored studies. And that's because a lot of these are designed to meet regulatory purposes. So what's happening? This is where it gets really interesting. We find differences in how the study is conducted behind the scenes, and then whether it gets published in full or not. So a lot of you have probably seen these kind of statements saying, this is from one of my papers, this funder had no role in study design, data collection, interpretation of the data, etc. And what we found in a study where we interviewed investigators that were funded by drug companies to do drug trials, so these were 200 industry-funded trials, we found that even if they had these statements, the vast majority of them, of the authors who responded, said that the sponsor was involved in the design of the study, in the data analysis, or in the reporting. So these are the percentages of authors that said the sponsor was involved. And what was really surprising is that only a third of the authors who responded said that they had the final say in the paper. So this is telling us that in the pharmaceutical industry area, if it's sponsored by a drug company, the sponsor has been involved in advising on how the study is actually conducted. And this is with industry contracts and all the protections you normally would get in academia. But probably the biggest area where we've shown that the pharmaceutical industry influences the outcomes of the research is in this area, whether the full results of the study get published or not. So I've done a lot of work in the past with pharmaceutical industry documents, and we've done quantitative studies to suggest that there's publication bias. But what we found looking at industry documents, and these are documents on a drug called gabapentin, was that the documents actually said that the results of the trials, and this topic, the outcome here was pain, if positive, and by that they mean if statistically significant for efficacy, will be published. And in this other document, they talk about a study that will not be published because it's not statistically significant. So that was sort of very blatant evidence from the documents that this was planned in advance to publish the studies if they were favorable and not publish them if they weren't favorable. And this is from work we did where we looked at drug trials that were submitted to the US Food and Drug Administration. So these were 156 of what are called efficacy trials. So these are the ones that were actually used to approve the drug. And we were able to look at what was submitted to the FDA versus what was published in the medical literature. And only about half of the trials had their unfavorable outcomes published. So you can imagine how that changes the literature. And then we looked further at this drug called gabapentin, and all these numbers down here show each individual trial, and then the p-values or statistical significance of the outcomes. And basically what we see here is that if there is not a statistically significant efficacy result, the trials tend to stay unpublished, or the outcomes tend to stay unpublished up in this corner. And these are just the primary outcomes. So for these 19 trials, the summary is that 7 of them were not published at all. 4 of them published some of the outcomes, but not all of them. They only published the favorable outcomes, and 11 of them only published favorable analysis or not. So this is just telling us that the picture we're getting in the scientific literature is skewed towards the favorable results for the drugs. And again, why does this matter? Because those industry documents have also told us, and I'm quoting, that research and scientific publication are part of the pharmaceutical industry's marketing strategy, and that the publication goal is to use the research to spread information on the drugs as widely as possible through the world's medical literature, and also to use this for education. They had quotes like, "Education drives this market." So they weren't just producing this research to test the drug. The point here is this research was being produced to help market the drug and to help influence the scientific literature in favor of the drug. And so I'll just wrap up by saying, and I know that we're going to get into this more with the later speakers, is that the consequences of this bias in the drug studies is really important. So overestimating efficacy and underestimating harms means we can bias systematic reviews, the decision aids that are used for patients or consumers. This kind of biased research is used in physician or health provider education. It's used in the marketing material, both to healthcare providers and consumers. It's reviewed by regulatory agencies, so they don't always get the full picture. This can drive up costs because we're improving ineffective or harmful drugs. And basically the bottom line is the information is misleading and it's not transparent, and it can potentially be harmful. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers to really drill more into this topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bero, for this overview, and I'm sure many attendees have questions. We will leave the questions and answers towards the end, and we will move with Dr. Fabri's presentation.
Thank you. I will start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see my slides? Yes, full presentation
Yes.
mode, right? Okay,
Yes, now
great.
presentation mode.
Great, thanks, and hello everyone. I'm Alice, and I will be talking to you about the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the patient groups, as this is a topic that is getting increasing attention over the last few years. As Lisa did, I also would like to disclose that my position is funded by the University of Bath, and I have no pharmaceutical industry funding. So there is increasing evidence that suggests that industry sponsorship can create biases in medical research, as Lisa has shown, in clinical practice. For example, in Lisa's presentation, we have seen how industry sponsorship of research can introduce systematic biases at all stages of the research process. Similar evidence also, we have also similar evidence that, for example, payments from pharmaceutical companies can also influence clinical practice and prescribing. And even if health professionals often believe themselves to be immune to the influence of industry sponsorship, actual studies have shown that doctors who have financial relationships with industry, even in terms of, for example, receiving free foods or meals or payments to attend the conference, those doctors tend to prescribe differently from doctors who do not have this financial relationship with the industry. So there has been, for example, an increase in prescribing quantity and costs for doctors who have relationships with the pharmaceutical industry. So the question now is, could industry sponsorship of patient groups also contribute to similar biases? So could pharmaceutical industry funding be compromising the patient group independence? So this is what we will try to explore in the next few minutes in this presentation. And let's start from the beginning. So first of all, what are patient groups? So patient groups are non-profit organizations that focus on the needs, on the interests of patients affected by a certain disease, by a certain condition. And these are quite influential stakeholders in healthcare. They are often involved in many activities. For example, they provide, of course, direct support to patients and families. They fund medical research, they contribute to guideline development, and they can also influence pharmaceutical policies because they often lobby, for example, for approval and public coverage of medicine. And the voice of patients is also increasingly seen as fundamental in health technology assessment and reimbursement decisions. And some public health agencies, for example, involve patient and patient groups in those debates, and often patients provide, for example, testimonies of their first-hand experience on how a certain disease affects them. So these are quite influential stakeholders in health and in healthcare. And of course, patient groups need to secure financial support for their activities. And this support may come from different sources, including the pharmaceutical industry. And in recent years, concerns have been raised about these relationships between pharma and patient groups because of conflict of interest and potential threats to the independence, to the integrity and credibility of patient groups. And of course, we can recognize that in some areas, these two actors, industry and patients, might have similar interests. So, for example, both actors are typically in favor of course, new, better medicines. They might be interested in increasing awareness of certain diseases within a public, but there are a lot of areas in which instead these two actors have divergent interests. For example, pharmaceutical companies are likely to prioritize sales to try to protect high medicine prices, while on the other hand, patient groups might be more concerned with affordability of medicines, or also might be also interested in exploring non-drug options for their conditions. So I think the bottom line is that industry funding places patient groups in a conflict of interest situation because the primary interest of a pharmaceutical company is to maximize profits. And this can conflict instead with the mission of the patient groups, which is to protect the welfare of the people that they represent. So definitely a conflict of interest. So now let's start to explore a bit more this relationship between pharma and patient groups, looking at some of the evidence that has been produced in recent years, both quantitative evidence and then qualitative evidence, to also try to understand what is the perspective of patient groups on this issue. When it comes to the quantitative evidence, I will mostly present the results of a literature review that we published in 2020, still quite recent, where we investigated pharmaceutical or medical industry funding, medical device industry funding of patient groups. And we looked at 4 research questions. So first of all, what is the prevalence of industry funding of patient groups? If patient groups receive industry funding, are they transparent? So do they disclose and report this source of funding? Do patient groups have policies to govern the relationship with corporate sponsors? And finally, is there any association between industry funding and the positions that these patient groups adopt on certain health or policy issues? So let's start from the first research question. prevalence of industry funding of patient groups. In the systematic review, we identified 15 studies that looked at this research question. And as you can see, industry funding of patient groups seems to be common, with prevalence estimates that range from 20 to 83%. The studies were conducted mostly in high-income countries, especially United States and Europe. So there is actually a lack of research on this topic in low middle-income countries where we do not know the prevalence of industry funding of patient groups. The second research question we had was around transparency. So what is the proportion of industry-funded patient groups that disclose information about the source of their funding? So we found 4 studies that looked at the websites and whether patient groups disclose this funding on their websites. And when we meta-analyze these studies, as you can see, the overall pooled proportion of groups that disclose industry funding was 27%. So this means that actually 3/4 of the groups that receive industry funding did not make this information publicly available. However, I want to disclose that the studies we found were published between 2008 and 2012, so there might have been additional shifts in more recent years when it comes to disclosure of financial relationships. So these studies are not super recent. The third research question we had was, do patient groups have policies to govern the relationship with industry? We identified 10 studies looking at this, and as you can see, the prevalence of policies ranged from 2% to 64%, but actually for 6 of these 10 studies, the prevalence was below, of policies was below 10%. So many patient groups still lack organizational policies governing sponsorship. And finally, we looked at whether there is an association between receiving industry funding and the positions that these patient groups adopt on health or policy issues. We identified 4 studies that looked at this topic, and these studies basically addressed a series of highly controversial issues like overdiagnosis, harm from opioid use, high drug cost. So situation where there is a clear conflict between the interest of the sponsor, of the commercial sponsor on one hand, and the interest of patients or the public. And in all 4 studies, they found that the industry sponsors group tend to have positions that might be aligned or may favor sponsor interest. For example, in one of the studies, they compared the position of patient groups, industry-funded versus non-industry-funded patient groups, on guidelines developed by the Center for Disease Control in the US to guidelines aimed at minimizing the harms from opioid use. And they found that while most of the non-industry funded groups were supportive of these guidelines, the guidelines recommendation, in contrast, most of the patient groups that were funded by opioid manufacturer were unsupportive of guidelines aimed at reducing harm from opioid use. So worrisome finding. Of course, these are just 4 studies, and this association of sponsorship and positions does not necessarily reflect an influence by the sponsor on the group agenda. It could also be possible that the sponsor basically selectively fund the groups that have positions that are already aligned with their interests. So we need to consider also this. So this was just a brief overview of some of the quantitative evidence. There have been also additional studies published in more recent years after our literature review, but this was just to give you a taste of what some of the quantitative evidence says in this area. But now I think it's also important to look at some of the qualitative evidence. So what is the perspective of patient groups on their relationship with the pharmaceutical industry? Here I do not have a literature review to present, but I would just present some findings from an Australian study led by Lisa Parker, where she interviewed participants from Australian patient groups. And I think it was quite interesting to see that all the participants recognize that the financial interactions between patient groups and the pharmaceutical industry would basically entail a give and take. So the participants recognize that these were business interactions where things of value were traded, with patient groups, for example, providing advocacy assistance or marketing opportunities in exchange for financial support from industry. This is a quote from some of the participants who are recognize that this is about asset exchange. So pharmaceutical companies don't fund for no reason. They don't fund just out of the kindness of their heart. So they recognize that patient groups wanting to accept industry money would mean that they would have to offer something of value in return, because pharmaceutical companies don't fund for no reason. Another interesting finding from these interviews is that there is basically a preferential industry funding of patient groups of current interest to pharma. So companies are only likely to interact with groups whose members are basically part of the current or future market for the drug. So patient groups that focus on a disease that could potentially be treated by the company product or a company new product. As these participants, for example, said, if we are not a big slice of their market, they're probably not wanting to put a lot of funds into our patient group. This qualitative finding is also confirmed by a more recent study published in 2023, where the authors basically assess the financial links between pharmaceutical industry and patient organizations in the UK, and they found basically an almost perfect concordance of pharmaceutical company interest and patient group funding. So because most of the payments, as you can see, went to patient groups that focused on a disease area for which the company has a product in its portfolio or pipeline. And I know that this makes complete sense from a business perspective, but it doesn't make sense for us from a public health perspective, because I hope you can start seeing the implications of this selective funding, because as I said, patient groups are powerful advocates with influence over, for example, health and pharmaceutical policy. So the selective industry funding of certain patient groups will boost the impact of certain patient groups over other groups that do not receive industry funding. So if the industry-funded patient groups are more likely to flourish because they will have more funding to support their activities, to participate, for example, to consultations, etc., this means that their voices will be amplified by the industry funding, while at the same time, the voices of the patient groups without pharmaceutical industry funding are drowned out, are basically lost. And this might be the group who are, I don't know, advocating for prevention or non-pharmacological intervention. So these are voices that are lost. And so this selective funding could lead basically to a commercial bias in the representation of patient interest. So just coming to a conclusion, I think that the data I've presented show that industry funding of patient groups is quite common. We've seen that transparency is still inadequate. Few patient groups have policies that govern corporate sponsorship, and we've seen how the selective industry funding of patient groups risk distorting basically the patient group sector message. So we definitely need to start working towards solutions. And I'll give you just a few ideas about this. I think we need short-term and long-term solutions. In the short term, I think two steps that would be clearly needy, but also easy to implement, would be greater transparency in reporting, of course, industry funding of patient groups, and policy development. So strengthen the policies that patient groups have to govern the relationship with corporate sponsors. And in the long term, instead, I think we need a broader discussion about industry funding of the patient group sector. I recognize that industry funding might be the only source of income for some groups. So I think that if we want to cut patient groups to cut industry funding, we need also to provide alternative. One alternative could be, of course, to have a more robust public funding of the patient group sector. I mean, if we recognize that patient groups' voice is important in the debate around, for example, pharmaceutical policy or other healthcare issues, then we also need to support them with public funding. But another solution that has been instead suggested is, if we can, for example, increase public funding, why don't we create a shared corporate pool of funds via tax on industry? So the idea is to tax industry and generate revenues that can be managed via an independent body that allocates these funds to patient groups. So this would still allow corporations to fund the patient groups, but breaking the link between the specific company and the specific patient group, because the money of the corporation would go into a blind trust that is independently managed to then fund patient groups and their activities. So these are just, I hope I've given you a flavor of the problem and of some of the solutions that could be implemented to address it. Stop sharing now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fabrri. Definitely a great overview using the qualitative and quantitative evidence. And thank you for providing solutions and recommendations. And I'm sure participants have questions regarding this topic. Our next speaker is Dr. Larkin, and he will be speaking about managing conflict of interest in healthcare, an overview of how transparency mitigation, or is it restriction that we need to apply. Thank you, Dr. Larkin.
Sorry about that. I forgot to unmute myself. So yeah, my name's James Larkin, and it's a real privilege to get to present to you guys. Dr. Bero, or Professor Bero, and Dr. Fabrri are researchers who I read and cite on a continual basis. So I'll be presenting on managing conflicts of interest in healthcare, transparency, mitigation, or restriction. So my disclosure is I'm a postdoctoral researcher in RCSI. I don't have any direct pharmaceutical or medical device industry funding, but my organization, RCSI, does receive significant pharmaceutical and medical device industry funding. So, just to give you some background, Alice and Lisa's slides did a lot of this already, but just briefly, I'll be talking about some of these areas, how the pharmaceutical and medical device industry interact with healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations through what they describe as education, the use of pharmaceutical representatives, what they describe as consultancy, sponsorship donations, and then research, and then ownership and investment interests. So just to, I suppose, visualize that kind of influence, you'll see there at the top of this slide, that's the medical device industry, or the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. And then below that is kind of their tentacles of influence, which you can see are extremely extensive. And they apply directly to patients or prescribers, as well as the things that influence them, such as like, clinical guidelines, research has been mentioned. And as Dr. Fabrri just pointed out, they indirectly influence all of these important outcomes through engagement with patient organizations, for example, and a range of other organizations that you'll see just at the top of that slide there. So I suppose the question is whether some of these interactions, like education or consultancy, are actually education and consultancy, or are they pretexts for marketing tactics? So there's a systematic review from a few years ago outlining that some of these interactions, like education, pharma reps, and consultancy, for them, there's a consistent association between them and inappropriately increased prescribing rates, lower prescribing quality, and increased prescription costs. So this can have a range of negative effects. That could be everything from overprescribing, for say an older person, but at the more severe end, it's associated with, say, the opioid epidemic, and in that case, hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's also significant influence in terms of organizations, and this has been discussed, but having influence on research, clinical guidelines, and then the actions for organizations. So how is this addressed? One of the main ways it's addressed is transparency databases. So the idea being that once the conflict of interest or the payments are disclosed, then this transparency helps address the conflict. So I have a bit of an Irish bias, being an Irish person, and this is transferofvalue.ie, where the pharmaceutical industry outlined their payments to healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations for things like education, consultancy, and things like that. Then you've got the Sunshine Act in the US, which brought about the US open payments system, where pharmaceutical and medical device industry are legally mandated to disclose these types of payments, whereas in the Irish system, it's a system of self-regulation developed by the industry. And then third, a favorite of mine, because no one knows about it, which will tell you how transparent it is transparentmedtech.eu, which I'd encourage you to check out. It's a medical device industry database for Europe, outlining payments to healthcare organizations. So you'll see there it includes things like the name of the company making the payment, the name of the recipient, the amount they received, and then in very, very vague terms, what the payment was for, support to educational events. So what are the benefits of this kind of system? The idea is that in the US, it was called the Sunshine Act, and the idea was that sunshine would act as a disinfectant. I'll go into whether that's occurring or not. The other idea was that it might allow public patients to decide if they wanted to change their practitioner or change their healthcare based on conflicts of interest. Thirdly, it was just supposed to generally increase trust in a healthcare system that might have problems in terms of conflict of interest. And then fourthly, it was to allow researchers, policymakers, and others to highlight issues, primarily because there was very notable examples of corruption occurring in the US, where pharmaceutical companies were giving what they described as kickbacks or bribes to doctors to prescribe certain medicines. So is that actually happening? So the downsides are that these databases are often very opaque and confusing. So lots of companies don't actually report on them, strictly for the medical device industry. When they do report on them, it's not really clear what the payments are for, or they might be anonymized, as in we don't know who's receiving them. So I mentioned there that, patients might be able to choose. Well, first of all, patients find it and the public and even myself sometimes find it very hard to understand what these conflict of interest actually mean. And then even if they did want to change healthcare, they mightn't have any other options. Thirdly, in terms of sunshine being a disinfectant, there's actually evidence to the contrary of this, that conflicts of interest have increased since the introduction of the US open payment system. And that might speak to the fifth point of this moral license for recipients. So the idea that if I've been transparent about this, then I can kind of do what I want because the problem is solved. So this allows the industry and recipients to claim the problem is solved, which creates this moral license. And then finally, an interesting point is that these databases allow industry to learn from each other. So, if I worked for a pharmaceutical company, I might look up to see what Pfizer are doing and say, oh, they're paying a lot of money to this healthcare professional, maybe we should be paying him too, or her too. So this is necessary, but not a sufficient step to address conflicts of interest. Then discuss maybe management more broadly. So pharmaceutical and medical device healthcare organizations issue short and long policy documents outlining how they manage conflicts of interest. So here's just a few examples, one from NICE, the NHS, BMJ, the Irish Medical Council, University of Connecticut Health, and then there's legislation as well, for example, this act in Ireland. So what do these documents do? They first kind of define conflict of interest for a whole range of ways. For example, they might exclude conflicts of interest that go back, say, more than 3 years ago. They might not be interested in conflicts of interest if the person doesn't have a high enough role, or if the role isn't related to it. Or sometimes they introduce these financial thresholds. So say, payments below $1,000 or €1,000 are not of interest, are not considered a conflict of interest. Secondly, they might start managing the conflicts of interest. So they'll say you might have to declare the conflict of interest as an employee. You might have to do some training around conflicts of interest. They might stipulate that grants should be unrestricted, as in no strings attached. They might say that if you have a very significant conflict of interest, you can't do certain things in the healthcare organization. Or they might say if they have a committee, for example, that only a small proportion of that committee can have a conflict of interest, or none at all. So an interesting one from those is the unrestricted grant. So this is another kind of tool used by both healthcare organizations and industry to get around the conflicts of interest issue, in my opinion. The idea is that, there is no conflict of interest because the grant is unrestricted. You can do what you want with it. These are some quotes from GPs we interviewed in Ireland about unrestricted grants. So they said even if it's an unrestricted grant, there's invariably going to be some sort of stand or brief comment made at an event. Secondly, they say that the donor or the funder will generally get a general association with the minds of 5 or 6 key GP practices. So this speaks to a larger issue, the idea of unseen influence and reciprocity. So reciprocity being the idea that if I get something from you, then in some way and somehow it's going to be indirectly returned. The other issue that I haven't mentioned here is what Dr. Fabrri expressed very well, which is this idea of just distorting the healthcare landscape. So even if hypothetically the grant could be totally unrestricted, it would still be sent to areas that benefit the pharmaceutical industry, and therefore areas that don't benefit might be under-resourced. So are these restrictions effective? Is the idea of restricting these kind of payments effective? So say organizations saying, we don't allow these payments, or either to our organization or to the healthcare professionals within our organization. So the Institute of Medicine published a very important report about 15 years ago, and they stated that academic medical centers should restrict gifts, industry-controlled presentations, ghostwriting, free samples, and pharma rep visits. So there's some low to moderate quality evidence that these kind of restrictive policies can be beneficial. So here's a quote from a study saying that it inoculates physicians against persuasive aspects of pharmaceutical promotion. So in relation to that systematic review I mentioned earlier, it kind of can maybe prevent inappropriately increased prescribing costs, inappropriately increased prescribing rates, increased prescribing rates, and lower prescribing quality. And I know that Dr. Fabrri and Dr. Bero are in the process of doing systematic review. I don't know if at the end maybe they can give us a sneak peek of some of those findings. So another interesting thing that kind of assesses restrictions is the Association of Medical Students of America. They have a scorecard and they go through a whole range of conflicts of interest and rate how restrictive the policies are of organizations. So I'm interested in organizations that have particularly restrictive policies and how they develop them. And two in Ireland that are of particular interest. One is the College of Psychiatrists in Ireland. They represent psychiatrists and their educational leads, and they do not accept pharmaceutical industry funding for any college activities. Another one is Aware, that's a mental health patient charity in Ireland. They also don't accept pharmaceutical industry funding. I think these are two quite interesting ones because they come from the field of psychiatry, which is a particularly problematic history in terms of its relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. The third was highlighted to me by, I think, an attendee, Joel Lexichin. It's the Oregon Association of Family Physicians, and they voted to forego pharmaceutical industry funding. And then Yale banned gift meals. So you might be interested that the pharmaceutical industry actually see it fit to make restrictions sometimes around these interactions. So AstraZeneca and GlaxoSmithKline both did this. However, it's worth pointing out that these both occurred in the wake of very, very significant scandals for these companies. And in my opinion, they're likely public relations exercises rather than true efforts to improve healthcare. And this is highlighted by U-turns on these policies that happened a few years afterwards. There are downsides potentially to restrictions. So the idea might be that we limit funding, say for education. However, it might be pointed out that a educational session in a drab lecture theatre in a hospital might be better than a marketing session in a swanky hotel. But also it brings us back to the point that Dr. Fabrri was making, which is we maybe need alternative funding mechanisms. One, I think, is just increases in general taxation overall, and part of that is highlighting rogue actors like Ireland who encourage tax avoidance with their policies. And we're the base to a huge amount of pharmaceutical companies as a result. Other downsides maybe increased cost positions, which speaks to the previous point. One interesting one is the introduction of other biased sources of funding. So, and a good example is that mental health charity I was discussing, Aware. So they, instead of receiving money from industry, they receive money from Cadbury's, which is a chocolate company, and also a company called Texaco, which operate filling stations or fuel depots in Ireland. And another example I'd give you is I was recently engaging with an aid organization who receives the majority of its funding from the state, and they refused to sign a letter I was writing because it criticized state policy. So it's a little more complex, unfortunately, than just totally getting rid of industry funding. So the other argument is that industry, being one of the primary providers of new drugs and medicines, are an important source of information, though it could be argued that maybe the more independent source of information would be better suited to providing that. So very briefly to sum up, conflict of interest could have a very major impact, and transparency is not enough to address that. And we need to consider ways to potentially restrict industry marketing practices, but we need to be careful about some of the unintended negative effects of some of those restrictions. Thanks so much for listening. That's some of my references, and I think we'd all be delighted to take some questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Larkin. We have a couple of minutes for questions. I just wanted to say that the voluntary restrictions you mentioned by pharma reminded me of how the tobacco industry chose to self-regulate and how ineffective that was. So we need to keep an eye on how this develops. I'm opening up for questions. I know there's a Q&A and we have one question on Q&A, but also please feel free to raise your hand virtually and also, unmute yourself if you need to ask a question.
Yeah, so I could just read some of the questions
Please
from the
do.
Q&A first. So the first question was directed to Dr. Bero. The question is, how can funding for research by the industry, I guess, be reduced? Like, how can we do that? That's a very good question, and one of those big questions.
Yeah, and I know that James is going to cover some of the solutions. And I think what's unfortunate is a lot of our conflict of interest policies are aimed at individuals. So, and I think the thing we really need to crack is to change the funding model for research institutionally. So some of the ideas that have been talked about have been consortia of funding. I've actually been in an institution that tried that, but no drug companies would contribute to the consortia, and that kind of tells you something, because they may lose then control over, the design, for example. But that's one big idea, and I know that people are trying that in different ways, and I think that's really important. I mean, obviously, to increase other sources of funding, keeping in mind that some of those could be also have negative consequences, but to try to increase interest in funding drug trials, also to potentially separate the funding of studies of harms of drugs from efficacy of drugs, and really taking those studies of harms out of the control of the industry and making those more government based. And just the last point in terms of changing a funding model, as I was trying to point out, a lot of the research funded by industry is really for marketing purposes. And so I have to question whether we even need that research at all, right? So maybe we just don't need to spend as much money on drug studies overall as the industry does.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Lisa. I completely agree. Because of time, I'm just going to ask the next question. So I think this was directed to Dr. Larkin. The question is, well, in the UK, where only generic drugs are used, how does the industry really influence prescribing habits? Isn't the prescribing influence more relevant in settings where branded drugs are used, for example, in the US, and where there's also direct to consumer advertising? I think it's actually open to the three of you. So if anyone would like to comment on that, like how is that being used? And I think I also like to add that question. So I'm from Nigeria, and I can tell now that I'm more, aware of the industry, how, because I'm a physician as well, like you would have the advertisement from drugs, and you do not know at that time that you're pushing the agenda. You just think, oh, well, it would be nice for patients to know about this medication. So how can we then control it in settings where the drugs are not always branded? You can just pick up counted pills. How do you control that in those settings? It's open to any of the three of you, please.
So on the generic thing, that is actually, it is a benefit of the UK system. My partner just started working here and was shocked at how they were much more prone to use generics than they are in Ireland. But overall, it's still a very lucrative market for the pharmaceutical industry, because there are plenty of medications where there are no generic alternatives. And secondly, there's lots of other ways in which industry can drive prescribing. In the UK, a really interesting example is joint working initiatives, which is partnerships between industry and the NHS to create care. Like often it's to create care pathways that help drive prescribing of particular drugs that the industry is selling.
Thank you very much for that. I think.
Can I just add that, I mean, even somebody's paying, right? Even for generics, so the government is paying and somebody is profiting from that. There's also products called branded generics, which are a big deal at WHO when we're talking about the essential medicines list. And there's very complicated rules related to patents and evergreening patents and creating the branded generics so that individual companies will still profit. So you get into that whole legal area, which I'm certainly not an expert on, but that is one way that there is an incentive even for pharmaceutical companies to promote certain generic products.
Thank you so much for that. I hope that was clear as well for the person that asked the question. Then the last question is, I think it was also for Dr. Larkin. Dr. Larkin, is the disclosure by presenters of receiving funding, sorry, I'm trying to read this question properly. Is the disclosure by presenters of receiving funding makes it kosher for them to go ahead and make the presentation? I guess the question is like, what is the objective of disclosure? Yes, so it goes on to say, to me, it's like a diabetic taking insulin and going and eating lots of desserts. Like, I guess, what is the point of saying that, well, I've been funded by them? Like, what am I, like, how does that help? I hope that, like, that is a good translation of the question.
Sure. So at a very basic level, if I was giving a presentation about opioids and I opened by saying I own a share in this opioid company, I think it would be helpful because it would undermine the person's presentation and I'd be less likely to listen to them, especially if I'd watched Professor Bero's presentation and I knew about the types of effects it had. When it gets less obvious, it definitely becomes less useful, and it's often used as a way of managing quite problematic and complex conflicts, when the reality is that there needs to be more complex efforts to manage them, or maybe that conflict shouldn't exist in the first place, or the person shouldn't be in a certain forum, whether that be a HTA hearing or an educational seminar for doctors, and whether it's appropriate for people with certain conflicts to be in those forums. So yes, transparency isn't particularly useful in a lot of settings, especially when its usefulness is over-egged.
Yes. So we'll just have one more question, and I believe, I just want to confirm that we're not missing any question from the comment. Oh yes, there are a couple of questions from the comment section. Well, there's sorry. Yes. So the question is, could you please comment on the possibility of conflict of interest now in the pandemic era, with the increased number of clinical trials during the pandemic era, which occurred in the Arab Gulf countries, where special arrangements were created to facilitate this research, such as to the level of research ethics committees and special approval. So I guess it's with the changes since the pandemic, how do you think that conflict of interest is currently happening, especially within the Arab Gulf countries? Thank you. Yeah, I think anyone can take this question.
Well, I think it's a tough question, but I don't think the pandemic really changed the underlying issues around conflicts of interest. In terms of research, the pace of research increased. There was urgency to develop and test therapies, but the conflict of interest issues remain the same, really.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to just go through the comments to make sure that there was no question, because we are running out of time. And for me, I would say that I've learned a lot. I would leave Dr. Irma to close, but I have learned a lot, especially thinking about it coming from a third world country. I really enjoyed the idea of a database of transparency. I don't know how that would work when people don't know, like patients, like kind of how Dr. Alicia talks about, when the consumers themselves do not even know that I have the option to check whether this is being pushed on me, or if my doctor is forcing me to take this prescription, because most patients just take what is being advised. So it's really good. And I think as a researcher as well, I keep on thinking, shouldn't even journals that accept these publications scrutinize, why am I publishing a paper, or why are we having a policy that was heavily funded by the industries? I think everybody has a role to play in this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. And obviously there is an education role, maybe a curriculum role. How do medical doctors and how do public health researchers get informed about this research so that they're aware when faced with potential conflict of interest, how to address it, how to mitigate it. It's very important because this unseen influence, this term that Dr. Larkin mentioned, this unseen influence is important. And many maybe public health professionals will say, I know, I will not be biased. Maybe others get biased, but I will not be biased. So it's very important to hear that presentation and see the evidence behind it. Thank you so much for the presenters and for the participants. This is our first webinar in 2024, and it will be posted on the webpage of the network. And please keep looking for future announcements of webinars coming up in this year. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, brilliant.